Doctors with disabilities exist in small but impactful numbers. How did they navigate their journey? What were the challenges?
What are the benefits to patients and to their peers? What can we learn from their experiences?
And how do these experiences differ within different medical systems?
I'm Lisa Meeks.
I'm Peter Poulos.
And I'm Quentin Clark from the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities. And together we are thrilled to bring you the Docs with Disabilities podcast Canadian series.
Over the next 6 weeks, we are excited to present a 6-episode collaboration with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities.
Join us as we explore the stories of learners and providers who study or practice in Canada.
Hello, and welcome back to the Docs with Disabilities podcast. In this episode, we continue our collaboration with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities with an interview with Dr. Franco Rizzuti, a public health and preventive medicine physician and the current president of the CAPD. In this conversation, Dr. Meeks and Dr. Rizzuti discuss how Dr. Rizzuti's disability impacted his perspectives on patient care and share the work that Dr. Rizzuti is doing with the CAPD to better support trainees and providers with disabilities. We begin with an introduction from Dr. Rizzuti.
My name is Franco Rizzuti, he, him. I am a public health and preventive medicine physician working as a medical officer of health in Alberta, Canada. I call Treaty 7 land and the land of Métis Nation 3 home, and absolutely delighted to be here today to talk a little bit about just my story and some of the work that the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities is doing. Currently new staff, just finished residency recently, and my story with disability started in medical school. So about midway through clerkship, it was serendipitous. I was actually off doing some administrative work for the medical school with accreditation, and during that was involved in a motor vehicle collision resulting in herniation at L4-5 in my back. And so had the experience of transitioning back into clerkship now with a chronic back injury and chronic pain, and really trying to figure out, okay, how do I integrate this into my story, into my journey? And also I was at the point of thinking about, how does this affect career? How does this affect what I want to do as a residency, as a specialty for the rest of kind of life? So I will say that CAPD was a great connection and support at that time to help navigate some of that.
Thank you so much. We're thrilled with this partnership, and it has been such a joy to get more acquainted with the Canadian system. So I feel like I'm learning on 2 levels, which is always fun for me. I wanted to start our conversation talking a little bit about how your disability, especially since it was mid-training, changed your approach to patient care.
It was an interesting experience, right? Because one never enters training thinking that, oh, I'm going to be living, a parallel path to that of my patients. And so it was a bit of an eye-opening experience. A couple things that stand out is I definitely began to have a different appreciation for the challenges patients have with having to go to one specialist only to then be referred somewhere else, to be stuck in a 6-month wait list, to get bounced back to where you started, and fast forward a year and you're really no further ahead. And so I come to really appreciate the frustration and challenges patients were experiencing in just the clunkiness of a very large health system. And so that definitely became very much front of mind to me, of how could I be more of a patient advocate, but also a bit of a shepherd or steward in the system to support patients as they went through, especially these handoffs between various services or disciplines. The second piece, and this aligns very well with my general thinking with public health is really being thoughtful that it wasn't just, the medical need. I find often as a physician and as a trainee not that long ago, we're kind of ingrained into this mindset of here's the box that the physician works within. Here's the biomedical needs of the individual, and that's what the doctor does. And, sometimes either due to capacity or system structure, and the mindset is okay, well, as a physician, you don't do all that other stuff. You don't do the psychosocial supports, you don't do the community supports, etc., etc. And I started to turn that on its head and say, well, maybe that's not my primary function. Maybe I'm not the content expert, but I have a role to be a collaborator. I'm very much channeling and advancing that broader element of the social determinants of health, and figuring out how can I as a physician support. And then the last piece was really coming to appreciate the stigma that exists. I knew there was bias. I knew that patients were experiencing this judgment. As a physician living with a disability, there's also that sense of sometimes feeling you need to be a bit closeted about your story or cautious as to how you tell it. I just didn't have the words to label it. And through my studying, I've really come to use the word stigma and come to realize the tremendous stigma that exists still in healthcare, that exists even within the profession, and that it's often not malicious or intentional stigma, it's systemic stigma, it's implicit bias. It's all these elements that we all have a role to reduce that stigma, to make patients feel more comfortable, and to really return to patients their voice, their autonomy in their care, in their journey. And so these were the few things that really came to light. I went through this journey, and I think I'm a better physician because of it. I think I'm able to connect to my patients a little bit better. I obviously don't disclose that I'm a physician living with a disability at every encounter because it's not necessary. But a lot of these learnings definitely underpin and ground my clinical work.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think that is so in line with the other stories that we've heard and this kind of reevaluating of what a patient is and what they're experiencing. One of the many reasons that we need more physicians with disabilities in practice, one of the things that you've said in the past is that it's really important to have physical and mental diversity present in healthcare professionals. It really takes a toll on you mentally. And so I wonder how your experience and the leading over into the mental health space that might have occurred informs not only your care of patients on the physical and the kind of system and navigating the system level, but how it also affects your knowledge of what they're going through mentally, just being a patient with a chronic illness or being a patient with, chronic pain.
I really like the framing of there's the physical component and the mental challenges, just the additional cognitive burden. And so I can say, as one who has lived now the last 7 years with chronic pain, it's highly unpredictable, right? There are some things that I know will be a trigger, and so I avoid them. As I was training, some of the physical limitations because of my disability were very front of mind early on as I completed clerkship and then my early years of residency. Right? For example, I couldn't stand all day. I used to be able to do that. I couldn't stand in an OR for 12 hours in a day or even 8 hours in a day. It would fatigue and flare up my back. That physical accommodation was, probably the simpler, but the more complex, as you kind of alluded to, is that, mental burden, that unpredictability. You wake up one day and a back is in spasm or you have a pain flare, and really trying to figure out, okay, how do I manage that? How do you create the flexibility for yourself? And so as I reflect that and have that in mind when I'm thinking and interacting with patients, it is very much front of mind for me of making sure in every encounter I take the time to hear their story. And I think often in healthcare, it's very easy to remove some of that qualitativism, some of the story for the trade-off of efficiency, right? We're very busy. We have wait lists that are longer than we care to admit. We have a variety of challenges, and so we become efficient. And one thing I caution, now my junior trainees that I'm training is you need to recognize that there is memory aids to help us, but we need to make sure we don't have the blinders on. Of yes, perhaps certain subpopulations, certain ethnic groups have a higher risk of certain diseases, but we can't allow that to blind us to their story. I'm very, very cognizant to give the patient time to to tell their story and not to put on biases, not to put on blinders, not to hear that they're taking pain medication and automatically go down, a substance use or perhaps, addiction mindset, but really hear their story and understand where they've been, what their journey has been. And then the last piece that I think as a specialist, I get phone calls all the time from other specialists or generalists consulting about a patient. And the one thing I've really been thoughtful to make sure I do is to go back and talk to the patient. We've, again, at the expense of efficiency, have sometimes gone to a point of, oh, yeah, you take a call from, your colleague in the emergency room or in the community, and you get the story from the physician. And I've pretty much now said, if something doesn't add up, if it's not a slam dunk, no questions asked, I want to talk to the patient. I want to hear it in their own words.
It's interesting to me because I think the argument is always, well, efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. But then I think about the quality of patient care that we're delivering. I always wonder if you could set up some sort of research to look at how much time do we actually save when we listen, not just talk to them, right? We listen to them.
In the next section, the conversation shifts to focus more specifically on the role of the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities in supporting Dr. Rizutti and other physicians with disabilities.
When you did your introduction, you brought up how meaningful CAPD had been to you as someone who developed a disability in training, and finding this space and finding this community was really important. I wonder if you can talk about this in the bigger sense of why mentorship or why having people with disabilities be available and be part of a recognized community is so important to people like you that become disabled during training or even beforehand.
In Canada, we are still a very small proportion of physicians with disability. And so with such a small number, it's very easy to feel lost or uncertain. And if I extend this to the patient population, it's also a challenge of our system generally is set up to to be consistent and standardize as much as we can, which works on the masses and works at the population level. But when we get to an individual, that's where the system starts to break down. That's where it's easy to get stuck in a certain path or take a wrong turn. As I reflect on my story and just thinking about system supports, I think it is really important for individuals to see folks like themselves in in leadership roles, folks like themselves in careers that they're interested in, because it's uplifting. It breaks down these systemic barriers that probably shouldn't be there to empower folks. But I think, in the actual moment, as I reflect on my story and my journey, and many of the colleagues I've talked to, I've supported over the last many number of years, it's really easy to be told something that's incorrect. Maybe an administrator, maybe a contact person doesn't actually know the policy or the process, and they say something, and without knowing that that is correct or not, you take that at face value. Why wouldn't you, right? That's the appropriate response. But then that sets you into a pathway of maybe spending 3 months, 6 months, a year focusing on the wrong thing, or it puts a challenges getting an accommodation. And so I think having folks who understand the system, who can say, that's actually incorrect, here's the right person to talk to, or to say, you know what, the process is all right, but just something doesn't sound right. And to be that mentor, to be that sounding board, I think is incredibly powerful and incredibly useful. The last piece is sometimes you just need someone to talk, talk it through, to have the conversation with in a safe space, in a non-judgmental way, to say, hold on, I want to make sure that this makes sense to you. I just want another perspective. And so I think overall, right, as you know, within the physician space, within the trainee space, important to have these mentors for ourselves. But similarly, again, as we look to how we support the system and our patients, I think this is a role that all of us in healthcare have, of how do we support these grassroots group, these community-based supports. And again, being very mindful that this is not top down. This is not us saying, oh, I think this is a problem, this is what you need to do. Rather, working with the group, whether it's folks living with disabilities, whether it's folks in the BIPOC community, whether it's folks in the queer community, etc., and saying, what is your experience? How can we support? And then empowering them and removing barriers to resources, to things like that, so that they can have the system that supports their needs.
I love it. I've been doing this work long enough to have the absolute pleasure of seeing trainees start out as students with disabilities, go into training as a resident with a disability, and then enter the workspace as physicians. And then it's interesting to me to see the evolution of these individuals over time and how they go from being the mentee and how they've benefited from all of the things that you've mentioned, and they evolve into becoming the mentor. You've gone from benefiting from CAPD to now, leading many of the things with CAPD. I wonder in what ways you hope to grow your role as a mentor in this space and things that you've thought about doing.
I was really fortunate, reflecting back 7 years ago, connected with the president of CAPD at the time, who was actually a friend of a friend, and she provided terrific counsel and was involved in advocacy at various levels, and really, gave me a sense of hope is not lost. Here's what's possible. And she recruited me to join the board. And when I joined CAPD, a lot of our work as an organization, and we are a very lean organization. We are an affiliate of the National Canadian Medical Association. We take membership from across Canada, coast to coast, trainees, so medical trainees, resident physicians, in practice physicians, retired physicians. We allow people to disclose as much as they want. There's no requirement to, out themselves if they don't want to. And really, when, they put in an application to join, there's no cost associated with joining. And our mandate is really, how can we support you? When I joined, a lot of CAPD's work was mostly in how do we support those in practice with a disability who maybe have had to take time off from work, are in that transitioning to, a different income stream, to needing to figure out, can they return back to work, or are they, now unable to work as a physician because of their disability. So a lot of our work was, in more established individuals living with a disability. And there was less work at that time in the trainee space. And it was really hard to figure out, why is that? And the best of my ability now, as we think backwards, is stigma. There wasn't the comfort, the ability for trainees to disclose. There was a lot of perverse incentives and disincentives, frankly, to disclose. It could mean you might not be able to finish medical school. You might not be able to get a license to practice as a resident physician. It may make getting full license even that much more complex, et cetera, et cetera. And so with all of that, there just wasn't the support. The evolution over the last few years with some absolutely terrific board members and volunteers we have with the organization, we started to, in addition to the work we were doing supporting physicians with disabilities in practice, really started to build out a trainee set of supports, of information about, if we're thinking about the residency matching process, just information about what do you need to disclose, building out more supports for medical students, for resident physicians with disabilities. Working, right now I'm working with our National Resident Matching Service on some of their equity, diversity, and inclusivity work. We're working with our national partner for academic medicine on more comprehensive post-secondary supports and inclusive communities. So we've kind of expanded what we do. I would like to think it's more comprehensive now, from the beginning of training all the way to the end of career. There still are some parameters. We don't do a ton of advocacy in the pre-admission to medicine. It's a little bit more complex there, and it's just such a large group that we don't have the capacity to do that. But I think that's really been kind of a lot of the fuel in what I've been doing, and the focus of our group is to support those early on, because we know, like lots of things in medicine, it's a pipeline, and we need to reinforce and strengthen the pipeline. And if we want to get to our long-term vision of an inclusive profession, a profession that reflects, the Canadian populace, we need to support our pipeline, and we can't be losing folks because of old barriers that are in place that don't allow them to, meet and reach their potential and live the life that they want to have.
In the next section, Dr. Rizutti expands on how he views disability inclusion. Listen or read along as Dr. Rizutti shares why he believes that welcoming and supporting healthcare providers with disabilities is not only morally correct, but essential in order to improve the healthcare system.
I think a lot of people regard disability inclusion as the right thing to do, but you referred to it once as not only the right thing to do, but the essential thing to do. Can you talk about the meaning behind the differences in these words?
I've often spoken that we're still in a space where a lot of people will say, we need to accommodate folks, trainees, physicians with disabilities in the more general sense, individuals living with disabilities. We need to accommodate them. But it's often very much in the space of, there's a legislative requirement, there's a legal requirement, there's a duty to accommodate, and that's kind of where it's positioned. And it tends to be very limited. And I challenge that thinking, and I challenge that mindset. I agree, it is an absolute necessity to do. But in many ways, I see that as that's the bare minimum. And to draw on kind of our overall social evolution we're seeing in the last decade, we know that having a more inclusive workplace, having a more inclusive society, a more diverse workplace and society is positive for society, overall leads to better engagement, better health outcomes, etc., etc. And so we need to stop talking about this as well, this is what we have to do because we have to do it. Because I find in that mindset, we tend to come up with all these caveats and exceptions and build policies upon policies upon policies to kind of restrict how much we have to do and come up with excuses for why we can't do something. And I shifted it to say, no, this is essential. If you want to have a healthcare system in 2022 or in 2030 or in 2050 that meets the needs of Canadians, then you need to have people in the system who reflect the population base. We think about this, right? In the mid 1900s, even as recent as 1970s, 1980s, if I look at med school class composites, right? We can use an identifier of gender and say the vast majority of physician trainees back then were male. That shifted. My med school class had over 60% female, an appropriate evolution in time. What we're still not seeing, though, is diversity using other metrics. And disability is one we continue to not see great representation. And I've alluded to this before in the past that one of the challenges is data is measuring is the disincentives of trainees being open about their experience, their disabilities, their needs, because the system tends to add roadblocks instead of giving them opportunities. But I think overall, if we want to have a healthcare system that's going to continue to serve the population, we need to have folks with lived experience in it. And we need to empower that voice, empower that experience, and not just say, oh, great, you check off a box of having a disability. Now, can you just put that away on the shelf and not have that lived experience come into your practice? We need to empower them to say, how do we use your experience, your perspectives to make the system better?
I absolutely love that. And so often what I hear is, how do we get people with disabilities into our space, as if it's really difficult, where it's actually not. If you just invite them there,
Mhm.
you probably already have them, right? You probably already have individuals with disabilities practicing in your healthcare space or teaching in your medical schools. They just don't feel safe disclosing. But when I have these conversations, I get the distinct perception that it's about numbers. How can we get X amount or X percent of people with disabilities into our space so that we can say that we're a diverse program or a diverse institution or a diverse hospital? It's not seeing the value, it's seeing numbers. I always try to shift those conversations to that value system. You're not just getting a number, you're getting someone that's coming with a wealth of experience. You've said before that there's a limited number of Canadian physicians with disabilities, and we don't actually necessarily know how many Canadian physicians with disabilities there are because we have limited data. But, in the US, we've just this year published the first ever national accounting of physicians with disabilities.
Mhm.
We also published in the same year the first ever national accounting of interns with disabilities. And so we have this infrastructure, we have the question bank, we've built the models to do the analysis. We are well situated to support you and other Canadians in bringing this research to life and collecting this data. And so I'd love to know how we could potentially work together to change the fact that there is no data in Canada.
I'll take a couple steps back and speak to the interesting situation we have in Canada, right? So, in many ways, surprisingly, Canada is probably a decade, if not more, behind our United States counterparts in overall just disability support, advocacy, awareness. And what's really interesting is despite Canada in many ways having a lot of social supports and programming within the healthcare space, as I alluded to, there's still a significant amount of stigma and fear. And so I've have been trying to approach the challenge of understanding what the population is and being mindful of two elements. So globally, I think we do need to know a bit more, and it would be terrific to be able to collaborate, right? Use established processes, establish questions to drive this up. And it's been something that we've been trying to do locally in Canada for the last almost half a decade now, with very limited means to do so. So our collaboration, from the beginning would love to do it. I think the two parts, though, as I was saying, for us to think through is one is, you know, the actual let's get the data figured out. I think that's the easier element. I think the challenge in Canada, and this is the second part of kind of this double barrel challenge, is our overall population denominator is smaller. And so, even if we look at saying disabilities, visible and invisible disabilities, are going to be similar in the professional space, in the healthcare worker spaces, it still means we're going to have some pretty small N in certain schools and certain places. So it's trying to figure out, how do we protect that individual privacy when the system is still lagging in terms of supports in place. And so the one thing I hear from a lot of trainees still is there's fear to out themselves, to talk about their disability, for fear of not being able to get the accommodations, or fear of that making it harder for them to get a license or get a job. And so I think there's still a lot of work in the Canadian system to do on normalizing and destigmatizing healthcare workers with disabilities. So I think, as I said, it's a dual barrel approach that CAPD is very keen to work on, is how do we work on the destigmatization and bringing resources into support accommodations. And then on the second part, which, as I said, very happy to collaborate cross borders, is how do we start counting? How do we create a means to get this national census of what the actual count is? Because I do think we need these numbers.
I will definitely be connecting several people in the space and just seeing how we can support. It's something we've been able to do in the US, and it's been impactful. I think it's raised awareness of the topic in the US to a really nice level where people are starting to pay attention. And I think it sounds like we agree that the numbers we get won't even be a representation, right? It will be an underrepresentation because of all of the system-wide barriers and biases and ableism that are pervasive in our healthcare system. I assume are equally as pervasive in your healthcare system. But I think we have to start somewhere benchmarking this so that we can watch for growth and measure whether our interventions, our educational tools are helping to either bring more people into the profession or reducing the barriers and the belief systems to the extent that people feel safe disclosing.
In this final section, Dr. Rizutti shares his words of wisdom for leaders within healthcare spaces, students and trainees with disabilities, and anyone who wants to play a role in making healthcare professions more inclusive. Listen or read along as he discusses the importance of being open-minded, challenging stereotypes, and providing role models and mentorship for students seeking to find their place in the medical world.
I think my, kind of global summarizing or additional comment, I should say, is that I challenge everyone who works in this space to be very thoughtful about, is not to have preconceived stereotypes of what a physician with a disability looks like. I think our notion historically was, this means somebody with a very significant life-altering disability. So stroke, some sort of spinal fracture, and related sequelae. These sorts of kind of narratives and pictures is usually what we used to hear. That's what I had heard early on. And it was often grounded with the extremes. And it was extreme absolute comments of, well, if a trainee is deaf or has visual impairment, they can't be a physician. And I would just challenge people on both things. One, to be very open-minded, that disability means something different to each person. And so going back to some of my earlier comments of allowing the individual to tell their story and then the second one is for folks to really challenge that binary ableist mindset of a physician can't have, a major sensory impairment or have a mobility limitation in order to be a physician. So again, take apart and deconstruct our foundational assessments of what does it mean to be a physician. And I will give COVID and the pandemic appropriate recognition. The pandemic has accelerated virtual care and shattered a lot of these fixed beliefs in a way that 10, 20 years of advocacy hasn't been able to do. And so I think we are in a very exciting new era with virtual care, with new means of providing care to patients, to really rethink what is actually the foundational technical standards, technical requirements of a physician. And so I think it's really exciting. I think there's a lot of opportunity to have some very bold and forward-looking discussions about how do we start building the healthcare system, the group of professionals that we want to be providing care for the next decade, next 50 years, next century plus.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful, and I think your points are really important. I often start my training sessions by asking people to shut their eyes and imagine what the first thing that they think of when they think of a physician, and then to consider what a disabled physician looks like, which is often a psychiatrist, or a physiatrist is often a wheelchair user, without the breadth and depth of disability representation. And so I think that's a good exercise, and a really important note to help close this interview. The final question that we ask all participants is to provide some sort of advice to the listener. Our listeners come from many stakeholder populations, including pre-medical students, pre-health profession students, medical and health profession students, faculty with disabilities already working in this healthcare space, and administrators, leaders, disability researchers, and advocates. So we have a pretty wide range of listeners, and the advice could be tailored to any of them. But really, I think what the podcast was built for originally was to provide that asynchronous mentoring and advice to learners, to students who are going to join the pathway or are already in the pathway to the profession, and to provide them with some really important advice as they navigate this space that is, as we've discussed, is not always friendly to the disabled trainee. Do you have any advice you want to leave us with?
I think the global advice I would give, I'll target this to trainees and, that whole spectrum of training, whether it's, pre-healthcare, pre-medicine, maybe, in secondary school and post-secondary, wherever one is on the training, is to really be open-minded. I find our system is struggling, I will say, with credential inflation and the need for more and more credentialing. But it is also really starting to focus individuals in on a specified pathway, on a specified career early on. And I remember even in my early days of medical school, it was barely day 2 of medical school, and people were already thinking of what specialty they wanted or what subspecialty they wanted to be in. And I would really challenge and just encourage folks to be very open-minded. I ended up in public health. I love my career. I love where I'm at. Most of us in public health have a very meandering path to find public health. But I know many folks who have had meandering paths to where they are today. And I would encourage folks to just be very open-minded and think about what are the opportunities, what are the possibilities, and not to exclude things because you've been told that it's not possible or because you haven't seen that role model. So to reach in some ways for possibilities and opportunities that you may not have thought or have seen role models in, but also to just be open-minded that if for some reason a pathway you really wanted to go was just not possible, to be adaptive, to be flexible, to think about what are other ways to do the work you want to do. And I think then on the flip side, to all of these individuals who support our trainees, we also have a role to not just, in many ways, I find the system's very good at closing a door, but not good at providing an alternative. And so I would put that challenge out to folks. If we're going to close a door within our powers, how do we support them to find an alternate path support them to really reach their potential and do what they want. So I think not everything's possible, but I think we have an opportunity and a bit of an obligation to support our trainees find meaningful paths.
That's wonderful advice for two distinct sets of stakeholders. And, so often I think we create these paths and people think they have to have these perfect paths. And yet, when I reflect on my career, and you probably have some of these same feelings, I'm, I think, more grateful for the jobs that I didn't get or the work that I didn't do because it brought me to the space that I'm in now, which there would be no predetermination that this would be my career because this career didn't exist, right? 3 decades ago when I was first entering medicine and, thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, I could never have imagined. And yet, when I think about it, there's no other career I would want. There's nothing else that I think could bring me the passion and the fulfillment that this work brings. And so many people I talk to have those similar feelings, right? And that if they had followed the prescribed path, they might not be nearly as happy. So to be open, I think, bringing two pieces of your advice together, if I can, is just, for the community to be open to the possibility and disability, but also be open to the possibility that we don't know the next profession within medicine. And there are so many different ways I think that especially the disabled community can impact medicine. I think we're just starting to create space. And so we've seen things like chief disability officer, head of innovation. These are all new within the last 2 to 3 years. I think that there's going to be absolute space for occupational medicine. I think we need people with disabilities to be informing occupational health, public health. I could go on and on. So I think that is really, really good advice.
Well, it has been my absolute pleasure to be here and be part of this series. And as you said, it's a small community that continues to grow. So happy to be part of it and come back anytime and do what I can to pay it forward.
To our guest, Dr. Franco Rizzuti, thank you so much for joining us for this interview. I know that your advice and insight will be extremely valuable to our listeners, whether they're located in Canada or beyond, and we are so grateful for the work that you and the rest of the CAPD are doing to support physicians and students with disabilities. We're so excited to be able to collaborate and contribute to your goals through this series. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us for this interview. We hope you'll check out the other episodes in our 6-part collaboration with the CAPD, and we hope you join us next time. We also encourage you to check out the International Conference on Academic Medicine, which will be hosted by the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada in Quebec City in April of 2023. The keynote for the conference will focus on ableism in medicine. Head to icam-cimu.com to learn more. This podcast is a production of the Docs with Disabilities initiative as part of a special collaboration with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities. This podcast is supported in part by the University of Michigan Medical School Department of Family Medicine and Disability Program, the Stanford Medicine Alliance for Disability Inclusion and Equity, and the Ford Foundation. This series was made possible through funding from the Canadian Federation of Medical Students Strategic Innovation Fund. The opinions on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the respective institutions, partner organizations, or funders. It is released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Non-Derivative License. This series was developed by Quentin Clark and Lisa Meeks and produced by Lisa Meeks, Sophia Schlossman, and Jacob Feeman.